August 20th, 636 AD. The Yarmuk Valley, along the border of modern-day Syria and Jordan. Byzantine scouts rode back to their camp, their horses frothing at the mouth, their faces drained of color. What they reported seemed impossible. The Muslim cavalry they'd been tracking, those primitive desert raiders on their small, unremarkable horses, had just executed a maneuver no military academy in Constantinople had ever documented. 5,000 Arabian mounts, each weighing barely 800 pounds, had outflanked, outmaneuvered, and utterly decimated the left wing of the Byzantine heavy cavalry. 15,000 armored destriers, the pride of Rome's successor empire, each beast carrying over 100 pounds of armor plus a fully equipped cataphract, lay scattered across the valley floor. The Byzantine commander, Vahan, stared at the reports. His hands trembled. This violated everything he knew about warfare, about physics, about the natural order of military dominance that had ruled the known world for a millennium. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple military defeat. Before we uncover the truth about how the Battle of Yarmuk shattered every assumption about cavalry warfare and changed the course of human history, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We bring you the darkest, most fascinating chapters of history that textbooks conveniently forget. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now, let's descend into a story about the day an empire learned that everything it believed about power was wrong. The year 636 AD represented a pivot point in human civilization, though few alive at the time understood it. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome itself, stretched from North Africa to the Caucasus Mountains. For over 300 years since Constantine's conversion, it had stood as Christendom's greatest military power. Its armies were professional, well-funded, and equipped with technology that hadn't fundamentally changed since the days of Caesar. The empire's military doctrine was written in blood and validated by centuries of conquered territories. At the heart of Byzantine military supremacy rode the cataphracts, heavy cavalry that represented the apex of 7th century military technology. These weren't mere horsemen. They were mobile fortresses. Each rider wore laminated armor that covered him from head to toe. Their horses, massive destriers bred specifically for war, carried armor plating that protected their chests, flanks, and heads. A single cataphract unit could break infantry formations that had held against conventional cavalry for hours. The horses themselves were marvels of selective breeding. European and Central Asian bloodlines, crossed and recrossed to produce animals that could carry upwards of 400 pounds, rider, armor, weapons, and supplies, and still charge at speeds sufficient to shatter shield walls. These weren't agile creatures. They didn't need to be. They were battering rams with heartbeats. In the summer of 636, Emperor Heraclius faced a crisis that threatened to undo everything his predecessors had built. A new force had emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, followers of a prophet named Muhammad who had died just 4 years earlier. These Muslims, as they called themselves, had already taken Damascus. They'd won smaller engagements against Byzantine forces. But everyone in Constantinople knew these were flukes, lucky skirmishes where Byzantine commanders had been caught off guard. The empire assembled a massive army, estimates ranging from 80,000 to 150,000 men, to crush this upstart threat permanently. Among them rode 15,000 cataphracts, the largest concentration of heavy cavalry the empire had fielded in decades. Opposing them, the Muslim commander Khalid ibn al-Walid commanded roughly 40,000 fighters. His cavalry arm consisted of approximately 5,000 horsemen mounted os and Arabian horses, animals the Byzantines considered barely suitable for warfare. The Arabian horse of the 7th century was a creature of contradictions. Small, rarely exceeding 14, 2 hands in height, weighing between 800 to 1,000 pounds. They looked almost delicate compared to the massive destriers. Byzantine military manuals barely mentioned them, except in dismissive terms. How could such small animals, incapable of carrying heavy armor, possibly challenge professional cavalry? What the Byzantines didn't understand, what their entire military doctrine was blind to, was that the Arabian horse had been forged by an environment that valued completely different attributes. For thousands of years, Bedouin tribes had bred these animals in the crucible of the Arabian desert. Survival there demanded extreme endurance, the ability to thrive on minimal water and forage, and explosive speed over short distances to hunt or escape danger. These horses could maintain a steady pace for hours under a sun that would kill European breeds. Their hooves were dense and perfectly adapted to rocky, sandy terrain. Their respiratory systems extracted oxygen with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. But there was something else. Something the Byzantines would only discover when it was far too late. Arabian horses possessed a skeletal structure fundamentally different from other breeds. They had one fewer lumbar vertebra, one fewer pair of ribs, and one fewer tail vertebra than other horses. This wasn't a defect. It made them more compact, more agile, capable of turning and accelerating in ways that heavier horses simply couldn't match. The stage was set. On one side, the accumulated military wisdom of 1,000 years of Western warfare. On the other, an evolutionary adaptation to one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Yarmuk Valley would become the testing ground for two completely incompatible philosophies of war. The first engagement happened on August 15, 636 AD, 5 days before the main battle. A Byzantine scouting force, roughly 300 cataphracts, encountered a Muslim cavalry patrol of similar size. The Byzantine commander ordered a standard charge, a tactic that had worked against every light cavalry force from the Huns to the Sassanid Persians. The cataphracts formed their wedge and thundered forward. What happened next appeared in multiple Byzantine after-action reports, each writer clearly struggling to describe something that shouldn't have been possible. The Arabian horses didn't flee. They scattered laterally at the last moment, moving with a synchronized precision that suggested either supernatural coordination or training so intensive it had become instinct. The Muslim riders used their horses' agility to flow around the Byzantine charge like water around stones. Then they counterattacked from the flanks and rear. Not with the mass and impact of heavy cavalry, but with a swarm of arrows and spears, striking and withdrawing before the cataphracts could wheel their heavier mounts to respond. The Byzantine force lost 47 men. Call a tactical elastic defense. The Arabian horses retreated at an angle, maintaining just enough distance to stay out of lance range, while their riders maintained a constant rain of arrows. For 3 hours, the Byzantine cataphracts chased an enemy they could never quite reach. Their horses, carrying hundreds of pounds of armor in the August heat, began to falter. Destriers started collapsing from heat exhaustion. Riders encased in their armor suffered heat stroke in alarming numbers. The Muslims lost perhaps 50 men. The Byzantines lost over 300, most not from combat but from environmental collapse. A Byzantine officer named Gregorius wrote in a letter that was later preserved in the imperial archives, "We are fighting an enemy who has made a pact with demons or jinn. Their horses do not tire, they do not slow. Our finest cavalry cannot close with them, and when we withdraw, they pursue like wolves, striking and fading before we can respond. This is not warfare. This is sorcery." The third incident was the one that should have changed everything. On August 18th, a full wing of Byzantine cavalry, roughly 5,000 cataphracts, attempted to execute a flanking maneuver around the Muslim right. The terrain was rocky, with scattered wadis and uneven ground. Perfect terrain for heavy cavalry to avoid, which is precisely why Vahan thought it would be unexpected. The Arabian horses navigated the terrain like mountain goats. Their lighter weight meant they didn't sink into soft sand. Their compact build and lower center of gravity made them stable on slopes that caused destriers to stumble. When the Byzantine wing emerged from the rough terrain, exhausted and with their formation in disarray, the Muslim cavalry was waiting. The resulting massacre was so one-sided that Byzantine historians later claimed the Muslims must have had 20,000 cavalry, not 5,000. It was the only way to explain the mathematics of their defeat. In reality, the Arabian horses' superior mobility in broken terrain allowed the Muslims to concentrate force repeatedly against isolated Byzantine units. The Byzantines lost 1,200 men in 4 hours. The Muslims lost 140. That night, in the Byzantine camp, arguments erupted among the commanders. Some advocated immediate withdrawal. Others insisted this was impossible. The political consequences of retreat would be catastrophic. The empire had committed its prestige to this battle. Vahan made a decision that would haunt military historians for 14 centuries. He would commit everything to one massive assault. 15,000 cataphracts, the largest cavalry charge in Byzantine history, supported by the full weight of the infantry. The Muslims would be crushed through sheer mass and momentum. He was operating on the assumption that cavalry warfare obeyed certain immutable laws. That weight and impact were everything. That mobility without mass was merely the ability to run away. August 20th, 636 AD, would demonstrate exactly how wrong those assumptions were. If this story is giving you chills about how everything we think we know can be completely wrong, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries about the moments when history pivoted on a single misunderstanding. Let's discover what happens next when 15,000 of the finest cavalry in the world charge toward their complete destruction. August 20th, 636 AD, dawn. The Byzantine army formed up in the pre-dawn darkness. 15,000 cataphracts assembled in the largest cavalry formation most of the soldiers had ever seen. The sound of it, hooves, armor, the breathing of horses and men, created a low thunder that rolled across the valley. Vahan's plan was elegant in its simplicity. The cataphracts would charge in 3 waves. The first would break the Muslim cavalry screen. The second would shatter their infantry formations. The third would pursue and destroy any survivors. Behind them, 50,000 Byzantine infantry would advance to hold the ground the cavalry took. At 6:47 a.m., based on the angle of shadows recorded in later Byzantine accounts, the first wave charged. What the Byzantines discovered in the next 4 hours would invalidate every cavalry manual written in the previous 500 years. The Muslim cavalry under Khalid ibn al-Walid didn't meet the charge. They didn't form up to receive it. They did something the Byzantines had no tactical doctrine to counter. They dispersed. 5,000 Arabian horses scattered across the valley floor in what appeared to be complete chaos. But it wasn't chaos. It was a formation so alien to Western military thought that the Byzantines couldn't even recognize it as a formation. The Muslim riders had divided into units of approximately 50 horsemen each. These units operated with almost complete independence, each with its own commander, its own tactical objectives. When the Byzantine charge came, these units didn't stand and fight. They opened gaps in their line, allowing the cataphracts to thunder through. Then they closed behind them and attacked from the rear. A Byzantine cataphract could not turn quickly. The horse was too heavy, the rider too encumbered with armor. Turning a destrier in full armor was a ponderous process requiring space and time. The Arabian horses could pivot in place. They could accelerate from standstill to full gallop in seconds. They could stop, turn, and accelerate again with a fluidity that made the heavily armored cataphracts look like they were moving underwater. The Byzantine first wave, 5,000 cataphracts, charged into what they thought was a broken enemy formation. They found themselves surrounded by dozens of small, highly mobile units that struck from every angle, then faded before the cataphracts could respond. Imagine being a Byzantine horseman in that moment. You're encased in 60 pounds of armor. Your horse is carrying another 100 pounds of armor plating. You've trained for years to deliver devastating impact in a straight-line charge. Everything you know about cavalry warfare tells you that once you break the enemy line, you've won. But the line doesn't break. It flows around you. Arrows come from angles that shouldn't be possible. When you turn to engage, the enemy is already gone, and new attackers are striking from behind. Your horse, bred for strength and endurance in cooler climates, is overheating. The animal's breathing becomes labored. Your mobility, never great to begin with, decreases with every passing minute. And those small Arabian horses just keep moving, keep striking, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. The first wave disintegrated in 45 minutes. Not destroyed outright, but fragmented into isolated clusters of cataphracts trying desperately to find something solid to charge at. Vahan, watching from his command position, made the decision that sealed the empire's fate. He committed the second wave. Another 5,000 cataphracts charged forward. They met the same tactical response. The Muslim cavalry, their horses still relatively fresh, repeated the exact same maneuver. Disperse, allow the charge through, close behind. Attack from angles the heavy cavalry couldn't respond to. The second wave lasted 38 minutes before it too fragmented. By 9:30 a.m., Vahan had committed his third and final wave. 5,000 cataphracts, the strategic reserve, charging forward to save a battle that was already lost. This time, Khalid ibn al-Walid sprang his trap. While 2/3 of the Muslim cavalry continued their harassment of the first 2 Byzantine waves, the remaining units concentrated against the third wave's flanks. The Arabian horses, unburdened by heavy armor, executed a maneuver that modern cavalry theorists would later call a double envelopment at speed. They accelerated past the Byzantine flanks, moving so fast that the cataphracts couldn't pivot to intercept them. Then they turned inward, attacking the rear of the third wave. While it was still trying to engage the Muslim center, the Byzantine third wave attacked from 3 sides simultaneously by an enemy they couldn't catch, broke in less than 20 minutes. By 10:00 a.m., 15,000 Byzantine cataphracts, the pride of the empire's military, were scattered across the Yarmuk Valley in isolated pockets, exhausted, disorganized, and incapable of coordinated action. The Muslim cavalry, having lost fewer than 400 riders total, began the systematic destruction of the Byzantine army. What authorities, what historians, discovered next would challenge everything the Western world thought it understood about cavalry warfare, about the relationship between mass and mobility, about the very nature of military superiority. The immediate aftermath of Yarmuk was chaos that bordered on apocalypse. The Byzantine infantry, watching their invincible cavalry disintegrate, broke and ran. The Muslim cavalry pursued for miles. Contemporary accounts describe the roads back to Antioch clogged with abandoned armor, weapons, supplies. Entire Byzantine units surrendered without fighting. When Muslim horsemen appeared on the horizon, Vahan himself survived, escaping with perhaps 30,000 of his original force. He returned to Constantinople and faced Emperor Heraclius's fury. But Heraclius wasn't angry about the defeat itself. He was angry because he didn't understand how it had happened. The imperial military staff convened what we would now call a formal investigation. Surviving officers gave testimony. The reports they filed provide an invaluable window into the Byzantine mindset as it grappled with the impossible. Gregory of Antioch, a cavalry commander who survived the battle, testified, "Their horses possessed demonic speed. Our finest destriers, bred for a dozen generations for strength and impact, could not catch animals that should have been suitable only for carrying merchants. We charged. They scattered like starlings before a hawk, but unlike starlings when they reformed, they brought death with them." Another officer, whose name has been lost to history, wrote, "The natural order has been violated. Smaller horses defeated larger ones. Lighter armor proved superior to heavy armor. Everything our fathers taught us about cavalry has been revealed as lies. Either that, or God has withdrawn his favor from the empire." This second interpretation, that the defeat represented divine punishment, became the official explanation. The Byzantines couldn't accept that their military doctrine was flawed. They couldn't accept that different environmental pressures could produce different evolutionary solutions to the problem of cavalry warfare. So they blamed themselves, their sins, their emperor's previous heresies. They learned nothing. The Islamic Caliphate, by contrast, studied what had happened with clinical precision. Muslim historians and military theorists produced detailed analyses of the battle. They understood exactly why they'd won. The Arabian horse's advantages weren't mystical. They were biological and tactical. Biologically, the Arabian horse had a larger heart and lung capacity relative to body size, providing superior endurance, denser bone structure, making them less prone to injury, superior heat regulation, allowing them to operate in conditions that incapacitated larger breeds, a metabolism that required less food and water, simplifying logistics, greater agility due to their compact build and lower center of gravity. Tactically, the Muslim cavalry had developed a doctrine that maximized these advantages, loose formations that prioritized mobility over impact, small, independent units that could exploit openings without waiting for central command, a preference for harassment and encirclement over direct charges, the tactical patience to wait for heavy cavalry to exhaust themselves before committing to decisive. The Byzantines had developed their cavalry doctrine fighting enemies who used variations of their own heavy cavalry model, Sassanid Persians, Gothic tribes, Hunnic raiders who had adopted settled warfare. Against these enemies, weight and impact worked. The Muslims had developed their doctrine in the Arabian desert, fighting tribal warfare where mobility meant survival. They'd taken those same principles and applied them to conventional warfare. The result was a revolution in military affairs that the Byzantines couldn't recognize because it invalidated everything they believed. In the years following Yarmuk, the pattern repeated across the Middle East and North Africa. Byzantine heavy cavalry charged Muslim light cavalry. The Muslims dispersed, harassed, encircled, and destroyed. The Byzantines lost Egypt, lost Syria, lost Jerusalem. Losses that fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization. Each time, Byzantine commanders reported the same phenomena. Horses that moved with impossible speed. Cavalry that fought like wolves, not warriors. The persistent belief that Muslims possessed some secret, some advantage beyond normal military capabilities. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. The Byzantines were fighting an opponent who had evolved to fight in ways their doctrine couldn't counter. Like a species encountering a predator it had no instinctual defense against, the Byzantine military simply didn't have the conceptual framework to respond. What's remarkable is how long it took for Western military theory to absorb these lessons. It would be nearly 500 years before European cavalry doctrine began to seriously incorporate the principles the Muslims had demonstrated at Yarmuk. The concept of light cavalry as something other than scouts and skirmishers, as a potentially decisive battlefield force, remained foreign to Western military thought until the late medieval period. The Arabian horse itself would eventually be recognized as perhaps the most influential breeding stock in equine history. Nearly every modern horse breed carries some Arabian bloodline. The very characteristics that made the breed so effective at Yarmuk, endurance, agility, intelligence, became the foundation for developing specialized breeds across the world. But in 636 AD, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, none of this was understood. The Byzantines had encountered something that violated their understanding of how warfare worked, and rather than revise their understanding, they sought supernatural explanations. The Muslim cavalry, meanwhile, continued their conquests, carrying with them horses that weighed half as much as their opponents' mounts, but would ultimately prove twice as historically significant. The Battle of Yarmuk didn't just change political boundaries, it demonstrated a principle that would recur throughout history. That advantage in warfare comes not from scaling existing technologies, but from developing technologies adapted to completely different environmental or operational requirements. The Byzantine cataphract represented the culmination of one evolutionary path in cavalry warfare: heavier armor, stronger horses, greater impact. It was a local maximum, meaning any incremental improvement in that direction yielded diminishing returns. The Arabian horse represented a completely different evolutionary path, one that prioritized endurance, agility, and efficiency over mass and impact. In the specific environmental and tactical context of 7th century Middle Eastern warfare, these attributes proved superior. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Heavily armored knights dominated European warfare for centuries until English longbowmen and Swiss pike formations demonstrated that mass and armor could be countered with tactics that didn't rely on matching them directly. Spanish conquistadors' steel armor and horses overwhelmed indigenous American forces until those forces adapted tactics that neutralized Spanish technological advantages. In each case, the dominant military PO were assumed its advantages were universal. They failed to recognize that those advantages existed within a specific tactical and environmental context. When that context changed, the advantages evaporated. The implications extend beyond warfare. The story of the Arabian horse at Yarmuk is a story about specialization versus generalization. The destriers were specialized for one thing: delivering devastating impact in a straight-line charge. In that specific circumstance, they were superior to any other horse breed. But that specialization made them vulnerable. When faced with an opponent who refused to meet them on those terms, their specialization became a liability. The Arabian horse, forged by the necessity of surviving in one of Earth's harshest environments, was a generalist. It could charge if needed, but it could also maneuver, endure, and operate in conditions where specialized breeds failed. Modern military theory has a name for this: the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. The side that can complete this loop faster than their opponent gains an often decisive advantage. At Yarmuk, the Muslim cavalry on their Arabian horses could observe, orient, decide, and act in fractions of the time required by Byzantine cataphracts. They were operating inside the Byzantine decision loop, rendering Byzantine superiority in individual combat largely irrelevant. This principle now appears everywhere. In technology markets, dominant companies optimized for existing conditions fail when new companies optimized for different conditions emerge. In nature, specialized species thrive in stable environments but often go extinct when those environments change, while generalists survive. The broader lesson Yarmuk teaches is uncomfortable. What we believe to be our greatest strengths may be context-dependent in ways we don't recognize. The Byzantines believed cataphracts were universally superior cavalry because they'd defeated every opponent they'd faced. They didn't understand they'd been facing opponents who all shared similar assumptions about how cavalry warfare worked. When they encountered an opponent with completely different assumptions, developed in a completely different context, their universal superiority proved to be an illusion. This same pattern plays out in modern geopolitics, economics, and technology. Dominant powers assume their advantages are inherent and permanent. They invest in scaling those advantages. Then they encounter competitors who've developed completely different approaches adapted to completely different constraints, and discover that their massive investments in scaling the old paradigm don't translate to the new one. The Arabian horses at Yarmuk weren't better than destriers in any absolute sense. Put an Arabian horse in a joust against a destrier, and the Arabian would lose badly. But warfare isn't a joust. It's a complex, dynamic environment where victory goes to whoever can most effectively exploit that environment's specific characteristics. 14 centuries later, we're still learning this lesson. Still building bigger, more specialized solutions to problems, then acting surprised when smaller, more adaptive solutions outperformed them in context we didn't anticipate. The ghosts of those 15,000 cataphracts scattered across the Yarmuk Valley are still teaching us, if we're willing to listen. What do you think ultimately made the difference at Yarmuk? Was it the horses themselves, the tactical doctrine that leveraged their strengths, or the Byzantine inability to adapt when their assumptions were challenged? Leave your theories in the comments below. Were the Byzantines victims of inevitable evolutionary pressures in military technology? Or could different leadership have recognized and adapted to what they were facing? Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of history, where everything we thought we knew turned out to be wrong, where the comfortable assumptions of empires collided with reality and shattered. Ring that notification bell, because next time, we're exploring another moment when the world learned that superiority is always contextual, always temporary, and always one encounter with a different evolutionary path away from obsolescence. See you in the next video, where we uncover the dark truths hiding in the margins of the history books.